Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We will just wait a few seconds for everyone else who's still trying to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. I can see that there are a few people still joining, so just a few more seconds, then we can kick off. Okay, let's get started, and as others join, they'll probably hopefully catch the latter end of the introductions. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Sorcero Thought Leadership webinar. In this episode, we will be discussing how KOL identification and engagement has been changing, and with the evolution of AI and accessibility to data sources, how that practice is shifting within pharmaceutical industry, and how medical affairs and commercial teams are now engaging with the KOLs. We're very lucky today to have been joined by Chris Straga, who will introduce himself in a moment, and our very own Hamza from Sorcero, who I'm going to just stop in a second and pass on to introduce themselves. Before I do that, maybe a very quick introduction by myself. I'm Zeinab Sulaiman, and I lead the Medical Affairs Center of Excellence here at Sorcero. And a quick disclaimer that these are non-promotional thought leadership webinars, during which we aim to discuss the latest topics that are relevant to our medical and commercial teams and are evolving with application of AI and data. With that, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself to our audience. Good morning.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Or good afternoon, depending on where you're checking in from. I am Chris Straga. I have a career in commercial and medical, most recently in KOL strategy and on the commercial side and also on medical. And right now I am a medical field educator for our field medical teams.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank
Z?
you.
Hey, everybody. My name is Hamza. I'm the Director of Data Science and AI here at Sorcero. Spent the last 20 years in the domain of data, and I'm happy to join in the conversation with Chris and Zeinab today.
Thank you, Z. All right, so maybe as we get started and to set the scene, Chris, it would be great to talk a little bit about the current state of KOL relationship between kind of KOL and KOLs and pharma, and maybe touch on some of the traditional approaches for identifying and engaging KOLs, and why there may need to be a transformation in the way that we are identifying and engaging. Very loaded question, lots of different components, but just your take on how currently KOL relationships and identification is happening within pharma and what may need to be evolving.
Yeah, a loaded question with lots of different parts there. I think one of the keys, I guess I'll start with some of the traditional methods and some of the misses there that I've seen is KOLs are identified sometimes by the fact that they've always been KOLs. We were told by multiple different people or different companies or they're identified by the amount of times they speak for a different company on public disclosure forums. And for lack of a better terminology, people say, that's the guy or that's the woman. You have to make sure that you influence her. And that person becomes a KOL and the KOL that everybody achieves to partner with. And some of those misses there, a lot of times the treatment can be antiquated or they have really scaled back the amount of patients they actually see. And some of their treatment algorithms or even just diagnoses are a lot different than the evolving landscape. So there has been a push throughout that I've seen throughout the companies that I've worked for in developing more detailed algorithm. How do we take into account and the new rising stars, KOLs that attend different conferences and are really have a mindset open to new treatments that weren't based in training 20, 25 years ago, and sit on different societies or even regional and local, that are willing to kind of put their neck out and really advance with new treatments. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, Chris. Yes, that's really, really helpful. And, I want to kind of also evolve that conversation and think about how pharma goes from, identifying KOLs and deciding that they want to have a relationship with a KOL, depending on all the factors that you described, to then forming a partnership, right? We know that the nature of those partnerships between KOLs and thought leaders in general and pharma is changing. And those are really important partnerships in general.
So
What are we achieving generally through these partnerships? And are these existing partnership models effective?
I think it depends on where you are and what those models look like at each different company. And I've seen them work tremendously and really backfire in the fact that when you're generating insights, especially from a medical community, and whether it's pre-launch, when you're partnering with a KOL, let's take a rare disease for an example. They're the experts in the field. They're the people that everybody turn to. That KOL, they're the top KOLs in a KOL. They're the uncommon amongst the uncommon. And when you partner, as you develop and you pull insights from these KOLs and how their treatment has changed, how they handle their patients, how they bounce ideas off of each other, a lot of the development of even setting up clinical trials or all the way down the line to marketing messages on the commercial side, when there's a partnership with a KOL, they feel part of that process. They feel part of that process as this new innovative treatment is potentially coming to market, coming to FDA approval. It's not a let us tell you how we think you should treat your patients and what data we think will align with your patients, and we need a partnership. It's that early on initiation with these top thought leaders who are the top thought leaders of top thought leaders that enable this partnership that is patient advocacy driven. And then once the product is approved and launched, the KOLs feel a part of that process. They feel, okay, this is a partnership and a treatment that has aligned with my needs and my patients' needs. And this is exactly where what I would want my patients to hear, or I would want physicians underneath of me to hear. This is the message I want to get out. Whether it's releasing the stigma of a certain disease and even changing verbiage to endpoints in a study or secondary endpoints in a study. And I think that's where partnerships work extremely well. And then I've also seen the exact opposite that I described, where there's insights gathered and a marketing team from a commercial that pulls them in and relies more on what they see and does not put the patient first. And then there's a butting of heads when the product is eventually launched and the KOLs kind of stand behind a wall and feel frustrated that their voices weren't heard and that the data doesn't support what is being mentioned in some of the marketing messages.
Do you think that happens because there is a disconnect between the insights that have been gathered, perhaps by the marketing team or those teams that are responsible for identifying the right KOL partners, and the way that data is being identified? What are some of those typical insights that leads pharma companies to decide whether a KOL is a suitable partner?
That's a good question. I think it's any and all the above. Sometimes those there's some lost in translation insights between medical and commercial, or even from commercial and the KOL or the IDN or the account. And I think there's just some reticence to put profits over patients in certain areas that I've seen, where trying to highlight an area or tease out a specific portion of the data that the claim is relevant, but is less relevant. But in the eyes of a marketing team and a commercially driven organization, may excel profits. And I haven't seen this on my side, but I know of incidences where where there's just that miss. And I think correct KOL identification is key too, as in you would look in that rare disease example, and there's some KOLs that have been KOLs for years and years and years and are still have slowly moved their practice to less and less patients and haven't really evolved in that rare disease treatment where it's rapidly evolving. Something is innovative and then something else is innovative, and you have these little stones that are built upon each other, and each treatment the algorithm changes, and they're still kind of 7 stones behind in how they treat just because they don't have the experience and they're not readily having these patients come to them. A lot of their career is built around these KOL and speaking and living off some older publications. So there's a miss with those different KOL partnerships, and also a miss just in internal organizations and speak. And again, some of those times it's actually been right where the marketing team has done due diligence with patients as well, and then relayed that information with KOLs, and their insights have changed as well.
Completely agree. And I want to come back to that idea of kind of academic influence, perhaps becoming more diluted the more they lose touch with the patient side. But before we do that, Z, I'd love your thoughts on maybe kind of pulling us up a couple of levels in general, and maybe kind of thinking about pharma and beyond. When thinking about using some of those insights that in some cases may be subjective insights, right, that a marketing team has collected on what they think about the kind of influence factor of those KOLs, how can the current model be utilized better with the application of existing kind of, not super enhanced AI models that we know exist and are being used, but some of the existing tools and processes that are out there? How can we kind of try and move away from that subjective analysis of those insights to a more objective model by which we identify the partners that we want to work with?
Yeah, I think to tie your question to a little bit of what Chris was even just saying, historically, the methodology that relies just on reputation-based methods and peer recommendations, those mapping tools that analyze publication track records and speaker engagements, they add objectivity by the way that they leverage structured data. But the tools focus on the what makes a KOL influential and miss how a KOL can influence a patient's care journey. And so I think not necessarily looking at really cutting edge technical AI models, but almost a middle of the road. I think we can take what works really well about these traditional mapping tools and algorithms. They're able to analyze publication and speaker engagements in a way that you can track measurable insights. They can help generate these lists of influential individuals within a specific domain. And they're efficient at broad scale analysis. So they can quickly scan large data sets and reduce reliance on some of these subjective factors like personal relationships or anecdotal evidence. But the limitations there that Chris also touched on is that there's a lack of context on influence pathways. And we miss a lot of nuance in communications. So these traditional tools analyze how effectively KOLs communicate complex medical information. How do they motivate behavioral change among clinicians or patients? In part, I think it's just as simple as influence isn't just about being heard, but it's also about fostering understanding and action. And I think that's where we add in some of these AI components that can overcome these limitations. We can talk about dynamic influence analysis. So an AI can analyze not only a KOL's output, like their publications or lectures, but also how their work is received. How is it acted upon by other stakeholders? So that would include assessing downstream impacts, such as did it result in a practice change? Did it change a patient outcome? Potentially even a policy shift. I think looking at communication and engagement metrics. So maybe running sentiment analysis and using natural language processing to evaluate how well a KOL is conveying ideas. How well are they engaging with their audience? How well are they addressing unmet needs? And then really being able to, I think, two last things, looking at a holistic view of influence. So by integrating multiple data sources, and not just historical data sources. So not just, how many times was this paper that you authored cited, but looking at all sorts of data sources about where information is able to be gleaned now. So that could be social media data, that could be real world data, that could be podcasts, it could be blog posts. AI can provide a 360-degree view of KOL influence at various points in the care journey. And then I think the last thing is really looking at rising stars and untapped potential. And so I think AI has the ability to excel at identifying emerging thought leaders who may not yet have an extensive publication history, but show potential through innovative ideas and growing influence network in some of these less traditional data sources, and AI's ability to really surface those patterns quickly and point out those folks that would maybe not ordinarily make it onto one of these lists is really powerful.
There's
Z,
a
can I add to that? I've seen some of those
Absolutely.
algorithms that take into a lot, and they work extremely well. Again, if it's good data in, it's good data out. But I've even seen scoring system based on likes on LinkedIn or reshares on different data. Like you described, social media posts, podcast, how many times a emerging star, if they ever take an opposing view to the traditionally held uh, um, algorithm, whether that's and supported by data, are they, and does that result in paradigm shifts? Are they able to kind of rock the boat with data, and does that lead to change? And especially throughout this some of these communities, it's change is very slow. So and with the ultimate goal of a lot of those, what you described, the emerging stars really have the patient at forefront, and they're tougher to find because they are taking some of those opposing views, are willing to say, okay, maybe we should take a relook at this, or hey, here's the newest data, and they're on a podcast and they're speaking about it, or they're sharing it on LinkedIn, or and it may go against, or at least just provide a different view than some of the traditionally held publications that have these career-long KOLs names as authors. And when that's built into the algorithm too, you really see how that affects improving patient lives versus just traditional KOL pathways.
Absolutely. And I think I agree with what you say, especially if these rising stars are potentially presenting an alternative view or an opposing view. That's certainly something to look at. But I think even for emerging folks that maybe are echoing the exact same view as a traditional KOL, but they're doing it in a medium or a media environment that is reaching a different audience or has a greater impact. And so, I'm wondering, just even as we've been looking at some of this stuff for different projects that we're working on, I have to work really hard in how I'm thinking about bias and variance in these algorithms. What does it mean if I've got a traditional KOL that's taking a position and potentially a rising star taking the same position? The traditional KOL has maybe written an academic journal that's got 15 citations, but this rising star KOL is participating in a podcast that has 500 back and forth comments and you know 5,000 listens and so I think also it's just about what type of media has what reach and how we factor those into an algorithm in a way that is really responsible and ethical.
I want to dissect two things that you guys just mentioned. First, I want to come back to the point that Z, you just touched on about all the different channels and the level of influence and reach that they have. But before we do that, Chris, let's just kind of maybe take a step back for a moment and think about all of these downstream type information that we're now able to get about, a KOL who maybe has this many publications. Once upon a time, that data point was enough to help us decide whether they're influential or not, or they're the right KOLs. But now we can also see we have information on, okay, how are these KOLs publications and their speaker engagements and the information that they're sharing on social media has a downstream effect on changing the care pathway or impacting the patient's eligibility for care or access to various innovative treatment. That information is new information that's now become available. Are pharma in a place where they are ready to consume and place that information, that downstream information, in a way that actually changes their engagement strategy? Or are they still more reliant on the traditional data to decide who they should be engaged with and in what capacity? I'm just trying to establish whether the use of AI and all of this additional data sources that we're bringing to the table is actually something that pharma is ready to accept, or do we have to still do a little bit more work in proving the value of these data sets for pharma to be able to incorporate them into the way that they go about their engagement strategy?
That's a great question. And I think my first experience with having an outside vendor that had a very detailed proprietary algorithm took in, and it was new. It was new. It really had these new data sets, and they were presenting it just like you guys are here. And one of the keys they really put into the algorithm, and again, I'm not a mathematician, and it was proprietary anyway, but how it scored these KOLs to tier them was their actual influence on patient care. So if you look at the traditional methods of university appointments and publications and really even funds to different companies for speaking and speaking engagements and symposiums at conferences and all the different traditional avenues, and really, as he described, the anecdotal, this is the KOL, this is the person, this is the end all be all. When you really look at some of the even regional or emerging stars, or even now their KOLs, some of them sit across a multi-care center that touches far more patients, far more patients. So their partnership leads to a change in far more patients' lives than that KOL, and they were able to capture that in their algorithm in that umbrella type environment of how many patients they actually would affect. So if they are sitting on a board across a 27 care unit for mental health facilities, well, how many patients with this disease state enter each one of those on average healthcare facilities, and this many physicians, and this is who they would touch, and these are the amount of lives that could potentially be touched by that KOL. And they may not have the publication status, they may not have the university appointment or the traditional tiered type KOL identification. But with this algorithm, they may score slightly below or even as high as these traditional KOLs, because you're pulling in, and they've been on podcasts. They're willing to sit on a debate panel at a conference and say, hey, this is how we've traditionally done it. This is what I've seen in my care facilities. And they back it up with not just published data, but also anecdotal and case studies and individual patient stories. And in a traditional type KOL mapping, they wouldn't have been identified. And they showed us that. They showed us the algorithm of how this KOL would be missed. And in their type of algorithmic scoring, they rose to the top. And then look how many patients that they affect. So I think it depends on the company to really how ready they are for it. But it was new and innovative to us, and it was really well received.
No, that's a really good example. Thank you for sharing it. And see, it ties in really well with what you were just touching on regarding kind of the different channels. Whereas the scientific congresses and scientific papers were once the main source of information, the main source of influence for many physicians and also kind of pharma companies to share and disseminate data, as you guys mentioned by the examples you just shared. Now, with the rise of social media and podcasts and all of these alternative channels, both patients and physicians are, consuming and sharing information in different ways. And that's something that has to be taken into account. And you both shared examples of how those factors are being taken into account. And Chris, as you mentioned, some of those rising stars are now, participating in podcasts and also able to back the comments and the information they're sharing with scientific evidence, which is the best of both worlds. However, kind of with that in mind, we also have to be mindful. And I think it's worth mentioning here that, with the rise of social media and the news channels that, they have a different purpose. Their primary purpose is not to disseminate and share scientific information in a regulated way. So some of the information that may get shared can be unregulated and almost sometimes difficult to verify. How do we take that into account? How do we take into account for those biases that may be there, that may influence physicians or patients or patient advocates, and that we need to be mindful of, but not dismiss the entire channel because there are some unregulated biased comments? But we just need to be mindful of it. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe Z, I'll start with you, and Chris, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of things that go into that. So as we're building out algorithms, one of the places that we start is if I'm looking at different publications, maybe I score those individually first. Where does PubMed rank in relationship to EuroPMC, in relationship to this article on Fierce Pharma? Could go through a whole series of publications and score the credibility of those and various institutions. And I think when we're assessing maybe what someone has said on social media, is that something, even if they didn't author this paper, is the position that they're taking one that I can verify in a publication? Can I use a technology called NER? So using kind of natural language extraction, named entity recognition, can I extract what's been posted on social media to something that appears in a reputable publication? And I think one of the benefits of AI is that that's not an individual person, right? That's going and having to manually do that research. It's something that can happen instantaneously. And so can we validate what's being presented on social media? A lot of times in the podcasts that we're looking at, clinical notes or linked studies are in the podcast notes. And so is the podcast where X position was taken by person Z, does it have linked clinical notes? Are there studies? Have they provided some sort of reference material? And then what's the score in the reputability of whatever reference information they provided? And I think all of these things have to come together in order to create this score. But I also think part of it is the way that we design the flexibility of the algorithm. Because what is important to client A as they put together their KOL list might not be as important to client B. Client C might have a higher risk tolerance and client D might have a lower one. And so working to build out an algorithm that has thresholds in it that allow for some flexibility and really partner with subject matter experts. Either like you, Zeinab, here at Sorcero, where I come and ask about the importance of different components, or in client-facing meetings so that we really understand how they're thinking about the importance of those things and then make sure that our algorithm is fit for purpose.
Thank you, Z. That's really helpful. And it also, at least for me, is reassuring to know that we don't need to be overwhelmed by the vast volumes of data that's available, because AI actually helps us validate and verify information that's on social media that perhaps once upon a time we thought we may have to validate manually. So that's really helpful and kind of makes the AI-driven insights much more applicable to this particular use case. Chris, anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a really good question, and I'm going to give a silly example, but I'm sure anybody who has a social media platform will agree. And Z, thank you for clarifying that. So there's people that take these positions for clicks. So they take or they take cherry pick one piece of a data even out of just a conclusion without really defining the results or the endpoints or having the applicability to the actual study. And I'll give a silly example, but the idea of nutrition experts, PhDs in nutrition, is very nuanced, and there's usually just trade-offs for each type of ingredient. We have the big fight now with food dyes and Fruit Loops. Food Babe is, I don't know, on a crusade. There's still Fruit Loops, whether you have fruit dyes in them or not. But you watch these, and you see a lot of them are medical doctors, and they go into a grocery store and create a big scene and pull out a product and then describe the one ingredient in it that they have now found, and they're the hero because they found that one ingredient. If you avoid that one ingredient, you're going to be completely healthy, and please come to their website and they'll have the supplement that supplies it. But a lot of that is just this big braggadocious attitude to create clicks. Are they now in a rising emerging star nutrition? Unlikely, and AI would be able to pull out some of the studies they cited, which I've seen by nutrition experts take those same studies and show how they show the exact opposite of what this grocery store hero has now presented and attempted to cite in the middle of a grocery store or put it in the background of their Instagram video. And the reason why I use that is because they're attempting to be salacious and the hero of their own story. And a lot of times, as soon as you break that data down, and an expert, like you, Z, described, somebody would have to go and search for that. They pull that study and show what that study actually shows. It usually does not coincide with the ranting and raving that went on in the grocery store. So with AI being able to verify and cite that, those type grocery store experts necessarily wouldn't be viewed as an emerging star just because they have this platform and got a lot of clicks and cited research, because it would show that they weren't necessarily presenting the data in the perfect light.
Yeah, and that's really great. And let me maybe add on two pieces of information. If we were at a macro level, if we're talking about measuring impacts on patient outcomes and working backwards, and then thinking about KOL engagement, then we also have to be thinking about social media engagement. And so not to give away any of the proprietary components of our algorithms on a live webinar, but when it comes to social media, especially, we really think about what are meaningful metrics and what are vanity metrics. So using Instagram, how many likes an Instagram post got does not factor into an algorithm. So if you think about how many times just you might mindlessly scroll Instagram and like something, those a like does not constitute engagement. So when we're talking about using social media engagement, and then how that relates as one small part of this algorithmic component in identifying KOLs, we mean engagement by was there conversation? How many replies were there? How many times was it reposted? Was it reposted by someone that's credible? If I'm potentially a rising KOL that does not have credibility in the historical ways that's been defined or talked about, but Chris, you do, and you're reposting something that I've written, and you're engaging in the content, then that adds some additional credibility. And then if I can take something from that and also link it verbatim to something that's been published, like that's how all of these pieces start to come together, and all of those different things would absolutely factor into the algorithm. But I did want to take a moment to establish between quality metrics and vanity metrics, especially when it comes to the ways that we think about social media engagement.
Thank you both.
No clickbait here.
No, clickbait here. But I think you both touched on really, really good points there, right? That there is a lot of information on social media. People sometimes post things for their purposes, for purposes that are maybe not aligned to scientific truth or scientific accuracy. And Z, you touched on how the use of AI can actually help us verify and validate where information are being shared and whether they're scientifically accurate or not. And all of these other metrics that we can use to establish the influence that a particular post or a particular KOL or a particular physician or even a patient advocate on social media can be bringing via their social media activities. So all of that helps us understand how information via social media or podcasts or all these other channels can actually help us really understand who the rising stars or influential voices are in the current landscape and how for us to how we can best use them. But I want to just take a step back, Chris, and also think about some of the traditional um, kind of KOLs that we're still engaging with. And you touched on this earlier that, you know, some of the KOLs, although they're very well published and have lots and lots of publications, they're losing touch with patients. And they're no longer being they no longer have that much access to patients. So therefore, they may not be as close to clinical practice or the voice of the patient. How how are we kind of taking into account for those situations where a KOL who might be really well established, have a very good reputation from a clinical or scientific publication perspective, but their opinions and their practices are perhaps now considered a little bit more traditional and not as innovative as patients need for it to be. Example that you previously shared was the rice practice, rest ice for when we have injuries. How do you see pharma taking that into account and overcoming those challenges where it comes to traditional KOLs?
Yeah, I'll give a quick background on that example I shared with you because it was very frustrating and it applies to this. And Z, you'll remember my wife kind of led the charge to take my daughter who sprained her ankle to sprains, strains, and fractures, I think is the name of it. And it's a multi-practice, multiple physician of all different ages, and they all really practice independently as far as their algorithms of how they treat. And I was I did not think that my daughter had broken her ankle, but that was part of it was to get an X-ray. So we went, and the physician came in, and he said, "Okay, you need to." He just walked through Rice completely, and wanted to put her in a boot. And I had said, probably I should have just ignored it, but I said I pulled up multiple different studies showing how ice impedes the healing, and it stops the inflammatory process, and she's not in unbearable pain and forced to take pain medications or anything. And he said, nope, this is the way it's always been. You ice, you rest, you compress. And I said, well, look, and I showed him multiple studies and showing that that's actually antiquated. It's been antiquated. And in fact, the coined term, the physician who coined the term rice spends most of his time retracting that, traveling around the country and retracting that. He's written multiple papers retracting how he was wrong. And the physician, he looked right at me and said, look, the guy that taught me is the number one guy, and he didn't change, so I'm not changing. And that was it. There wasn't the amount of studies that he could have seen to change his mind. To add to that, we went actually 2 nights ago just to get a follow-up, and the younger physician said she needs Graston, dry needling, consistent movement, which is the exact opposite. Graston is the job is to bring blood to the area, platelet-rich and cytokine-rich plasma and blood to the area that has trouble receiving blood, continue to move it, and he gave us a whole plan on how to move it. And he had a timetable that was about 6 weeks shorter than what the original physician had, and these are in the same practice. And so we look at what you described, and that's where those misses come into place, is that physician that he was an older physician, the one that we first met with, and the KOL that he was referencing had very minimal patient interaction anymore. He may not even be aware that there's other patients in practices that are doing much better without rice. They're getting back on the field faster, they have much better mobility, they're strengthening themselves in those areas to help avoid those injuries again. And he's just not aware because he's so far removed from that type of treatment. And I think that's where a big miss happens. And when I first heard that algorithmic example of KOL mapping was the first time that I saw, okay, here's a way we can attempt to tease this out, as maybe they aren't the best KOLs for improving patients' lives.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I wanted to ask you as a follow-up, that, those traditional methods of KOL mapping that many companies are still using are now proving to be less and less utilized by they're less and less pro patient advocacy, right? Like patients are now needing something completely different. And these KOLs are some of them are so set in their ways and their traditional practice that they are now sometimes, in some cases, no longer advocating for what patients needs and the best outcome for patients and the most innovative treatments, because they truly believe they're right. And those rising stars that Z was alluding to earlier, and that you were mentioning, or the kind of community physicians in some cases that have a lot more practice with patients, are in a much better place to be able to provide information or advocacy, or in many cases influence on what the patients need using the latest innovative treatment. So I think this is a really important aspect, and the evolution of AI and the abundance of data that now we have available to us is uncovering most of these challenges that we are now seeing with these KOLs.
Z, I'll defer to you, but I mean, I've seen some of these top KOLs that are far removed from practice and traditional KOL. They're identified long before as this specialist in this area, and I've seen them speak about innovative, first-in-class, first-time disease-specific treatment, and then not even use it and describe it. And now patients have unbelievable results. The efficacy is unmatched, and it's the only one available. And I've asked specifically or heard from our executive leadership of why, and it's, well, I'm just an older physician. I'm just trying to get to retirement. But they're speaking on the benefits of it, and their own patients aren't receiving this innovative type treatment. And I know you developing algorithms, and to answer that question, I think that's where you're able to kind of develop to tease some of that out.
Yeah, I think definitely, being able to use these algorithmic components and some stochastic inference to raise these patterns and look at those care gaps. I think the part that I don't solve is when we surface this and we recognize that gap. And I mean, what, for lack of a better term, I would maybe classify as hypocrisy. Like, you're this KOL, like, here's this paper, here's this speech, here are these citations, here's this claims data, here's this clinical trials data, here's how it's presented in Purple Book, like, here's where it made it into FAIRS, like, here are all of these different resources, but it doesn't bear out like in your practice, like your patients, as we map this all the way out, aren't benefiting from this care. And so I think the question becomes, when we've identified this gap, and when we've got the data to back it up, what then? Like, what happens next, so that we're actually using this data in a way that drives action. And so I think that's more a question for you, and Zeinab. If we've uncovered this and we see this pattern, and we can kind of showcase this this unmet need or this gap in patient care, and have the data to show why that is. What does it take from that place to actually drive some type of actionable change?
And I'm going to open it up to you, Chris, to maybe make some recommendations in answer to Z's question of, how do we now use this data to make actionable changes? I would personally love to see a future where medical and commercial, the entire commercialization team, even the development team were involved, actually use this dynamic data-driven approach to KOL identification and influence mapping to firstly identify who the right KOLs, or not even always KOLs, who the right influencers for a given activity or engagement is, and then use data to validate their extent of influence. As you were saying, sometimes they talk about a treatment that actually they're not really fully behind. How can we use data sources such as claims data or lab data or the clinical practice data were available to validate if what they're saying is actually what they truly believe in and what they're actually doing in clinical practice, and then use that dynamic AI-driven and data-driven approach to define how to best engage and partner with the right influencers and KOLs to ultimately drive the best outcome for the patients, right? I think that's what you should always come down to, that what is the best outcome for the patients, and how do we close those unmet needs and the care gaps in order for the patients to then receive the best treatment, and for, of course, the pharma companies to benefit and profit in the way that they need to. So that's what I would like to be able to see as the evolution of KOL mapping and use of AI and broader unstructured data. Any recommendations from your side, Chris, on how you'd like to see pharma change the way that they engage with KOLs and use these data sources to change their approach?
I think the more in-depth analysis of the algorithm is what is key. So we had multiple vendors that had came and presented for us, and one, you talked about claims data, it was a big part of it, and it is a big part of it. But it showed two, I think it was Kentucky and Ohio, had these KOLs that had no other scoring, sentiment scoring, or ability to rise to the top outside of their claims data. And it was just these two states that had a unique way that an ICD-9 code was registered. So that company had presented that we're missing all the KOLs. These are the KOLs. They all reside here, and they missed the forest for the trees. And so we had a couple different companies had presented and how they mapped it out, and it was based on our needs. And like I described, the last one was exactly what it was similar to what you and Z have presented to me and talked to me about here today and prior. And the uptake was great because it was the first time that we were able to see all of these different factors scored and tiering the KOLs. The product ended up not being approved for a part of the indication, so some of those KOLs had to drop off, but so it didn't, I guess we couldn't really see it through in practice, or I haven't seen it through. But more importantly, it showed, and then we compared it to what we had as traditional methods, and there was big gaps, big gaps. And then once we started our partnerships with those KOLs and the medical team started, it was on commercial at that time. Our medical team started their partnerships. We saw the fruits of that labor, and they really were the emerging stars, and really they should be viewed as these top KOLs, and they had significant amount of patient lives touched, and they really viewed patients as the top, and everything went below that. And they also were open to new care and understanding new molecules or pathways or receptor sites, and weren't stuck in their traditional type treatments. So for us, that was my first iteration of that type of vendor-driven, algorithm-driven mapping. It seemed to work really, really well and close some of those gaps.
That's a really good example, Chris, and hopefully a glance into what the future could look like across pharma if we adopt these practices across the board. And kind of really what I'd like to see is kind of for us to move out and move away from that micro level engagement strategies where we pick one KOL for their particular expertise in one area, and really think about that macro level that you were describing, where we really think about the care gaps and unmet needs and what can different type of stakeholders and HCPs bring to the picture, and how do we identify them and use them in that way. That's what would be a great way for pharma to evolve as they engage and build relationships with their OLs. But I'm gonna stop us here. Thank you both so much again for your contribution and for the fantastic examples that you shared, and for really putting all of this into context where it comes to thinking about how OL engagement and OL influence mapping should be changing over time with the use of AI and data. I'm gonna quickly check if there are any questions, and I believe that there may be a couple of questions before I let you guys go. So just a second. Okay, so we have a question. Thank you for the great insights. I believe a lot of those approaches apply well to the US, but given the limited access to granular claims data in the UK or Europe, how can we effectively validate KOL influence and align their practices with patient outcomes? Z, I'm going to open it to you first. I know that in the US, obviously we have claims data, and that's a really helpful additional source of data that you both refer to for validating KOL's actual clinical practice. But in the absence of claims data at that granular level, what other data sources can we use to verify the clinical practice that perhaps the HCP or KOL are claiming to stand behind?
Yeah, I think I mean, there's just no shortage of data. So absent that claims data, I think there are various ways to go about this. Definitely still looking at literature, at social media, at published journal articles, other public components. And I think if it was a client that we were signing and working with tomorrow, then I would also look at any clinical trials data that was available and talk to them about other first-party data sources that they might have. And even if those were not data sources that could be made available to us, the hope is that we've built the algorithm in a way, kind of that I was describing earlier, that we really could pass that along to our client, and they would be able to fit any first-party enterprise proprietary data that they had into that algorithm that really could take place of any data that we were missing. But that's a really great question.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Chris, anything to add to that?
I'll defer to Z on that one. He's the expert.
He is indeed the expert. And I completely agree with Z. Claims data obviously is a really rich data source that we do rely on quite a lot for our US-based clients and companies. But just because it doesn't exist in Europe and in the UK doesn't mean that we can't combine other various data sources like clinical trials, sometimes registry information, publications, etc., to find a different approach to validate information that we are seeing and hearing about a physician that claims to have a certain influence. So there is different ways to be data driven where it comes to this particular practice, and we should definitely explore all of those different data sources for each particular use case. Fantastic. I believe that there are no other questions. So I want to take a moment again and thank you both so much for your contributions and for your expertise on this podcast. It was really fantastic to have you both. Chris, thank you so much again for joining the Sorcero team on this podcast. We really, really enjoyed our discussions with you. For our audience, if you have any questions at all or anything that you want either of us to expand on, please feel free to reach out. I believe that an email will be sent out straight after the webinar with more information. And you can also find Chris on social media and LinkedIn if you want to reach out to him directly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.